listening to the History of Aviation podcast with Derrick Beeler, David Rowe, and David Gorman.
All right. I want to welcome everybody to the History of Aviation podcast once again. As always, I am joined by Mr. Dave Gorman and David Rowe. Let's see how you guys are, starting with you, Dave Gorman.
Hey, Derrick. Hey, Dave. I'm doing great. Glad it's Friday, even though it's Friday the 13th that we're recording this. It's a busy week back at school for me. Kids were all in good form, and I think teachers were too. So everything's going well.
How about you,
Yeah,
David
everything
Rowe?
good on my end as well. Just been a busy week at work. The weather has been causing me a few issues, a little cleanup, trying to get everything back to normal. And pretty soon we'll be heading into the racing season. So I'm looking forward to that, and we'll see what comes next.
All right. Well, Dave Gorman, let's just jump into this plane we're talking about. Tell us a little bit about what we got tonight.
Well, tonight we're going to feature the Albatros, the World War I German Air Force single-engine biplane fighter plane, single-seat fighter that was pretty ubiquitous and very successful run that it had over the course of a couple of different models that were built during the war. Amazing to think about the advances that were made in airplane technology. War will do that to you. And this plane certainly benefited quite a bit from construction techniques that we're developing, and engine techniques, and the guns and weapon systems, all that kind of stuff. So pretty fascinating aircraft that we're going to feature tonight, the Albatros.
Well, let's jump right into that, guys. Go ahead there, David Rowe.
Yeah, well, talking about the interesting things about the Albatros, I'm going to do a little history here for a second. So the Wright brothers first flew in 1903. So about 1910, Glenn Curtiss introduced ailerons and elevators to airplanes. So you go from wing warping in this boxy, really fragile airplane into a little bit more structured plane with movable elements in the air. And just 12, 13 years later, we have this Albatros, which is an absolute killer in the skies. If you look at it, it's extremely streamlined. It's really pretty to look at, and it does not look like anything else that's out there. All the other aircraft are sort of square, flat-sided. They've got the big radial engine in the front, and they're just kind of cookie cutter. They all sort of look basically the same, and the Albatros is just completely something new. And to my mind, it's really foretelling what we're going to see in the future. Particularly when you get up in the 20s and 30s and you start having air races. The design of the Albatros kind of sets the stage for what you're going to see for the fast moving planes later on, and even up into the jet age. That streamlined look is the look of today. So that plane was way ahead of its time.
Yeah, Dave. David was just talking about how the Albatros was way ahead of his time, Dave.
Well, it really was. I mean, it was definitely of its time, but it served, as we were saying, it served for a couple of years. I was surprised, and David, I lost a little bit of the audio there, so it's possible you mentioned this. I hate to repeat it, but surprised to know that Richthofen scored most of his victories in an Albatros.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, the flying circus was started with the Albatros. He's most identified with the Fokker triplane. However, that was the very end of the war for him before he was shot down. He only had maybe a dozen or so kills in that airplane. 3/4 of the kills of his 80 kills were in either a D1 or D2, D3, or a D5 Albatros. So yes, he was in the Albatros. That's where the red plane comes from. That was the first one he painted red, was the Albatros, not the Fokker triplane. But the Fokker name is what has lived from World War I. It's the biggest name that came out of it, and the Albatross has kind of been left behind.
When we think about some of the contemporaries, some of the planes that it faced in the air, the French Newport was a pretty formidable opponent, nimble, fast, good climber and everything. And then the Havilland, the DH-2s were also being flown by the British. So, it was these were planes capable of pretty fast climbing and lots of maneuverability, but also, it comes down to getting a gun on the other guy. And this was apparently a pretty stable gun platform too. Pilots loved it.
Yeah, that everything that I read said it was easy to fly for a new pilot and really good for the older pilots because they could really maneuver it. One of the things that was a drawback on it was it wasn't very maneuverable like the Newports were. That was one of its drawbacks. However, it had two machine guns that fired through the propeller with that interrupter gear. So it had much more firepower, and it was faster than those Newports and the de Havilland DH-2s. So it made up for the lack of maneuverability with, like you said, a good platform to shoot from, and it started really tearing up the control of the skies. That's another thing about World War I is it's a constant, this side leads and then another side brings out a plane and suddenly the Allies have control of the skies, and it just flopped back and forth. And the Albatross was one of those planes that made the switch from the Allies in control to the Germans in control.
This is an aircraft that a little under 5,000 were built, and apparently only two survive. Two authentic Albatrosses. I always want to say Albatri, but only two authentic Albatross survive. One is in Australia, and the other one is in the Smithsonian. And I don't know if you've seen the one in the Smithsonian. I have. I think the first time I saw it, I didn't know it was an Albatross. I was pretty young, but I remember looking at the pattern, that lozenge paint pattern that it has on the wing, and just being fascinated that was something that was being used as camouflage or just to break it up in the sky. There were a lot of experimental things being done, and as you say, the leaps and bounds in technology and the testing under combat conditions meant that what was in vogue in 1914 was passé by 1915, and you better keep a little bit ahead of what the other guys are doing.
Oh, absolutely. The interesting part about the Albatross is the D3 model. There were more D3s built than all of the planes before. So from 1914 to about 1916, you add up all those German aircraft, there were more D3 Albatrosses in service than all of those early planes. I mean, it completely replaced them. And as you were saying, that almost 5,000 units. It was one of the few German aircraft that was matching the Allies' numbers of aircraft. The Allies could just build more aircraft faster than the Germans, but the Albatross was one that was able to keep up. And one of the ways that they kept up is there were actually three manufacturers of the Albatross. The original company, which was what was that? Albatross Works AG in Johannisthal, Germany. They were the originators of it. They had a designer, what was his name? Robert Thielen was the designer of it. And so the D1 and the D2 were his first designs. They were built almost at the same time. And they went into combat, and immediately the D3 is on the drawing board, and they're building those. So they were producing this plane as fast as they could. And the reason was they were trying to beat it, get more airplanes in the air before the Americans joined the war.
And maybe have a decisive air power victory.
Absolutely. Yeah. They were trying to control the skies before, they saw the writing on the wall that if America came in, they were going to be in a lot of trouble. So they were trying to build up their numbers as quick as possible. The
I was going to say the engine for this plane was a Mercedes built engine.
Yeah, it was confusing for me when I was looking at it because the name of the engine is a D3A engine on a D3 Albatros. So
There you go.
it was, I had to read that a couple of times just to go, okay, it's the same name, just, two different things. On the engine front, about 180 horsepower for that Mercedes engine. One of the other builders was in Austro-Hungary, which is OFAG Erstflug, or OEF, and they actually put a 225 horsepower Daimler engine into the plane. So there were some pretty big engines being put into this little airframe.
I had the opportunity about 30 years ago to go to an air show down in Gunnersville, Alabama. And Frank Ryder was the name of a man who since has passed away, but he had a museum down there. And he had a bunch of World War I aircraft. And this fly-in was I don't know if it was held more than just a couple of years back then. And it was all very, very new to me, but I took video of the air show, and they had some full-size replica aircraft. They had a couple of authentic World War I aircraft that they flew, which was amazing. They had a Pfalz, PFALZ, German fighter plane that actually appeared in the movie The Blue Max.
Oh, wow.
That was there. It was really, really cool. But there was an Albatross or two there. And I just remember looking at the curvature of the fuselage, and it's absolutely it's a gorgeously constructed aircraft. And the techniques, you think about the Mosquito, the British to have a Mosquito with that same type of rounded wood that craftsmen who were building these things, and that kind of fit was really, really important. But being up close and looking at it and then watching it in the air, it's such an intriguing aircraft, and it's a beautiful aircraft, design wise and style wise, and the construction. So even in a replica, full size replica like the one I saw, it's just absolutely gorgeous.
Oh yeah, it's striking the difference to the other aircraft of the time, and that construction technique. It was by making it a big wooden fuselage, you got rid of all that internal bracing that the Spads and the Newports and those type of aircraft were using. So it was built in strong. But now imagine you get a few bullet holes through that wood. I bet that's a tough thing to have to fix, because that's all laminated plywood, and that would probably take some effort to repair, I would assume. But
yeah, no doubt.
They're craftsmen back then, though. I'm sure they had plans and ways of doing that were quick and easy.
So this is an aircraft that served almost exclusively with the German Air Forces. Don't remember what they were called back then, but the German pilots who flew this. But you mentioned also, I think earlier, David, did you say that Austria?
Yeah, that the Austria, hang on a second. Let me look at that name again. Hungarian. I'm out. Austro-Hungarian Empire had them.
Yeah.
They actually built them themselves under license. And from what I read, their version of the aircraft was the better version. Because something we haven't talked about yet is there is a weakness to the Albatros. The way it was designed, we were talking about the Newport earlier and how it was very maneuverable. Well, the designers of the Albatros copied the wing layout of the Newports to this Albatros, and it's called a sesquiplane wing setup. And that means that the one wing is half the size of the other. Well, because that half size, it's smaller, lighter, makes the plane more maneuverable, but it's weaker. And one of the issues with the Albatros was that it would shed its wing if you were in a really high maneuvering combat, or if you dove too hard, too long, the wing would just shed off. And that was an ongoing problem that they worked on continuously, never quite got it fixed. But that was, one of the things that, they tried over and over to get right to make it a as faster and more maneuverable airplane.
I believe that Richthofen actually had an accident in a Albatros for that very reason. A wing was collapsing or being shed or something, and he was able to get it down and obviously survive that. But if the opposing fighter pilots knew that that was a weakness, then chasing a plane down towards the ground or putting it through its paces to try to get it to shed a wing, that might be almost as easy as a gun kill. Not that that's easy at all.
Not in those days, no, I'm sure it wasn't, but that,
Destroyed aircraft is a destroyed aircraft. So
exactly. But yeah, that was a common thing. One of the things they used to call them V strutters because they have a V strut between the lower wing and the upper wing. So that was a nickname for the airplane. Yes, there you go, right there behind you.
can't see it, folks, but I'm pointing at a picture of one behind me that shows the V strut. Another thing I was kind of fascinated by was the different markings. Obviously, there are squadrons that are well known from World War One, like the Hat in the Ring, the Americans who were flying the Newports and everything like that. But there were some pretty gaudy paintings and some really brightly painted Albatros. I mentioned the one that's in the Smithsonian with the lozenge pattern on the underside of the upper wing, and I think the lower wing as well. But some really cool markings on some of these aircraft, and they had time to put that kind of effort to make them distinguishable in the air, because combat was still kind of a new thing. Things happened pretty fast, and being able to identify the enemy as well as who's on your side in the air would probably be really obviously a very important skill to have. So anything you can do to help yourself be seen by your teammates would be a good thing like that.
Well, and it's also a good thing to, instill a little bit of fear in your opponents when you come flying across and, everybody's painted up and you recognize that red paint of the Red Baron. You realize who you're up against, and do you want to stay and fight or do you want to go home? So I'd say there's a little fear involved in those paint schemes as well.
Absolutely. Well, so this plane saw some upgrades over the course of World War One. The D1 and D2 were the early models, and improvements in engine size and maneuverability and shaping of the wing. The D3 was the one I think you said, Dave, was the most produced. The 4 was actually never went into production.
No, it's experimental. They spent their time trying to make a lighter, faster version, and they just it didn't work. They weren't happy with it, and they just skipped right over it and went straight into the D5. There was actually only one D4 prototype built, so that one they just saw the writing on the wall and skipped it.
And then the D5, of which the survivors are examples of the D5, but that was till the end, when production ended. I guess they were finished up with the D5.
Yes, the Albatros was in combat till the end of the war. They had numbers, and they just they weren't building them at the end of the war, but they were still in service. So it had a really 2 years of life in combat, but for that time period, 6 months to a year was kind of the average for a plane. It would show up, it would be eclipsed pretty quickly and removed. So the Albatros spent a lot of time in combat. Excuse me while I cough.
You guys have any more, or are we jumping into final thoughts?
No, I got a couple of things here.
Okay.
Hang on a second. Let me check my notes and make sure what I got. Oh yeah, I've got some post-war and some variants to go over here.
Okay.
So all right, let me Oh, yeah, there's it. All right. All right. One of the interesting things that I did discover about the Albatross is there was a variant that I didn't know about, and that was the Albatross W4. And the W meant water. It was a float plane, which I was not aware of, didn't know that existed. They increased the wings, they increased the tail surfaces. They built 118, and they were June 1916 to December 1917. They worked the North Sea and the Baltic theaters, and then were training aircraft. So they actually had a float plane of an Albatross. Did not know that.
Had not heard that either. That's pretty fascinating. Dave, were any of these ever modified to carry bombs or external weapons of any kind?
Well, actually, yes. Post-war, several of those Hungarian planes went to the Polish Air Force. And in 1919, after World War I, the Polish and the Soviets went to war for about a year, and it was used as a ground attack airplane. So yes, they were putting some bombs on it and attacking the Russians with the Albatross. And so I'm not exactly sure how the hard points worked and how much it could carry, because it didn't go into that, but it was used for ground attack use. So yes.
Well, you can imagine that, all that kind of stretching outside of its original mission, the necessities of war kind of provide opportunities and the need to do those kinds of things. So I'm not surprised that it would be, modified field modifications. That kind of stuff continues to this day. So,
Well, that's one of the things about it. When you've got a good platform, you'll find new uses for it.
one of the other things that I thought is very iconic about the look of this plane is that it's got that bowl that covers the propeller, the spinner. It's covered in the nose and really gives it a more of a streamlined look. It's like they really were thinking about how can they cut down on drag. They got to have some things like the engine that's hanging out there a little bit and the landing gear and the struts on the wing, but looked like they spent some time thinking about other ways to streamline this aircraft.
Yeah, if you even go back from the spinner back to the engine is actually enclosed. Only thing that sticks out are the headers at the top. So the majority of the engine is wrapped up and covered. So yes, the aerodynamic knowledge was growing by leaps and bounds at this time, and this plane is an absolute benefit of that knowledge. I mean, it's obvious that they were thinking about, where's the air go and how do we make it go faster?
Yeah, that was the key to life.
So speaking of key to life, here's some notable people who flew the Albatross. We've already talked about Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. So he had 80 kills and 54 were in the Albatross. Oswald Bloche had 40 kills. He's sort of considered like the father of the German Air Force, setting it up. He was killed in 1916 in combat. Wilhelm Frankel, 20 kills, died in 1917 when the wing shedded off of his plane and he crashed. So he was, suffered from the weakness of the Albatross. Erich Lowenhart, 54 kills, died in 1918 in a midair collision with one of the other planes. He actually had a parachute jumped out and parachute did not operate correctly, so he did not survive. Carl Emil Schaefer, 30 kills, 29 of those were in a D3 Albatross, and he was shot down in 1917. And Kurt Wolf, 33 kills, was actually a member of the Red Baron's Flying Circus. He was shot down in 1917. And this one you might know, Ernst Udet was the high-scoring German fighter pilot that survived the war with 62 kills. And he would go on to become very important to the German Nazi industry at the start of World War II. So he had some really good experience to lead, to give to the Nazis as they were building up for their Second World War.
Goodness. And I guess Bruno Stockel had some time in there as well. That was George Papard in the Blue Max. So.
Yeah, and there's several good movies
I'm really
out there.
Impressed with how well you say those names. I would have that. I would mess that way up.
Oh,
Have you practiced?
Yeah, well, actually, yes, because the other manufacturers, the names are just so German, it's really hard to say.
Right.
And I've had to say them out loud a couple of times just trying to get it right, because it's, obviously I'm not a German speaker, but
exactly
try to do it justice.
You did a great job. As we're talking about the Albatros here on the History of Aviation podcast, let's jump into final thoughts, starting with you, David Rowe.
Oh, well, this one is it's just a beautiful plane to look at. It's an outstanding fighter plane. It, like we said, it was highly produced. It was very well regarded. Actually, Manfred von Richthofen was not a big fan of it because of the wing shedding that we discussed earlier. I think he wasn't very happy about having to make a crash landing in one. But just look at the plane. It's beautiful. It's got refined lines. It's sleek. It looks fast. Just completely different than anything else out there. It was on the bleeding edge of engineering and aerodynamics, and it had the positives and negatives of that early thoughts. It worked in great in certain ways and not in others, but to my eyes, it's probably the prettiest airplane of the World War I contemporaries. It just looks like the future is coming.
Dave Gorman.
I have to agree 100% with the as far as the beauty of this aircraft and what it represents as far as the future goes. This is a purpose-built killing machine, and so it had a certain brutality to it, a spareness in its design to do what it was meant to do, and it was very effective in the hands of a skilled pilot. But it's a shame there aren't more of these that are available to see, because in its time it was the Mustang of World War II, perhaps, World War I, perhaps. It was pretty eponymous and well regarded, and obviously lots of pilots had success in it. So again, going back to that show in 1992 that I saw down in down in Alabama, it's a looker, and it was hard not to just kind of swarm around it and just see the beauty of this thing, the round fuselage construction and the streamlined shape and everything. It's just gorgeous. So a favorite, and we're jumping around a little bit from era to era, so it's cool to go all the way back to World War I and pull this one up, because it certainly is worthy of inclusion as a great plane.
Definitely agree with that. As always, guys, it was a wonderful, interesting discussion, and I enjoyed it.
Well, we appreciate you, and looking forward to getting back together in a week or so and doing it all again.
Yeah, do it. We try to put one of these out every week, and we're staying pretty consistent with it. And I'm really enjoying it. I always look forward to, because we always do it on a different night, but I always look forward to History of Aviation podcast time. I really enjoy it.
Good stuff, and we appreciate folks spending time with us and listening in. Let us know where you're hearing us. So you're listening in on Spotify or some other platform out there. We're in all the socials and all kinds of places like that. So check in, let us know how you heard about us and what do you think.
Yeah, I'm speaking of social media. All of our social media is listed in the description of this podcast below, but we are on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and we're right there. And my policy on Instagram is you follow us, we'll follow you back. So we're starting to develop
Good policy.
A lot of followers. Yeah, we're starting to develop a lot of followers, and I think it's great. And yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it, guys.
Yes, sir. Enjoyed it. Thank you, guys.
Take care.
I'm gonna go ahead and close out the podcast. So for David Rowe, Dave Gorman, I'm Derrick Beeler. Thanks for listening to the History of Aviation podcast. That's a wrap.
Albatros. You are listening to the History of Aviation podcast with Derrick Beeler, David Rowe, and David Gorman.